Jay says, Mary and Joseph, we got Mick Silva in here in the ballpark. And he says, wow, haven't been on this channel in a while. Let me clear some of the cobwebs away. I was on the other night, you wanker, but you were watching the Bruins game. Anyhow, welcome aboard, folks. And you'll notice by the title, Diamonds and Dice, Politics, Religion, and the Hall of Fame. Dare we? Well, we're going to stay away from the first two. But the fun thing is we were discussing this before going live, and we want to welcome our special guest, Big Clue, Hall of Fame. This man has studied the Hall of Fame. It's his thing. Bernie will get into that with him in a little bit. But we've talked about this, and I think for anybody, for you're talking sports Hall of Fames, but for me it's baseball, that I think that those discussions can be far more heated than the former two subjects. So we're going to talk about that tonight, but we're going to relate it back to gaming. And the last part of it will be maybe talking about some Hall of Famers. Maybe you've played in a played against or in a replay league, fantasy league, whatever, and how they've done for you. Dwayne Martz joining us. So I want to introduce the founder of this idea first, Bernie Strom. He's the guy in the beard, by the way.
Well, there's two beards. He's the guy in the white beard. Anyway,
yes, I'm the guy in the white beard, and Bernie's the pirate fan. Wait, backwards. Dwayne, how you doing, bud? And again, it really is a pleasure to have Big Clue on here with us. Big Clue and I have talked a lot on the Discord, just personal calls about the Hall of Fame, and he has some very, very interesting perspectives on it. And without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Bernie because he's sort of like the Dan Rather here. He's very good at the interviewing and stuff. I'm shite, but I'm here.
Well, thank you very much, Beatles. You're here because of your vast knowledge and wonderful personality.
I thought I was here because I had attractive hair. But anyhow, go ahead, please.
And also the fact that you have a lot more followers on YouTube than I do. So
that's because I bribe them all. Why do you think I have to work for a living?
Anyway, we're here to talk about the Baseball Hall of Fame, and it often sparks debate among fans, historians, and analysts regarding the inductees in the Hall of Fame. And some people argue that certain members of the Hall of Fame don't belong there and they don't meet the statistical benchmarks typically associated with Hall of Fame status. And others contend there are plenty of deserving candidates that are overlooked. And tonight we have Big Clue, who's the expert on the subject, who's going to discuss all of these Hall of Fame controversies. And for our audience, I'm sure everyone knows who Big Clue is, but you might not know how he got interested in the Hall of Fame.
Well, before we jump into that, I just want to mention the irony. If you guys look at, although you're not showing it, I'm going to show it just for a second because I want you guys to see it because there's a beautiful, delicious irony here. Let's do this. Let's see. So if you guys look closely at Big Clue's avatar, there you go. We're talking about a guy that many, including myself, believe should be in the Hall of Fame and isn't. So Big Clue, this is perfect, man. It's perfect.
I never noticed it, but there it is.
I completely forgot that wasn't Mr. Redleg anymore.
I love that. Anyway, Big Clue's a history buff, and if you're going to study history, the history of baseball, where's a better place to start than studying about the Hall of Fame? And this has been a hobby of Clue's, and he's read almost every book, if not every book on the subject. And when I was talking to Beatles a couple of weeks ago about doing this show, there was nobody that I wanted on more than Clue, who I know knows as much about this subject as anybody ever discussed it with. And so
you see, I wanted Kate Beckinsale on the show, but Bernie wouldn't hear of it.
No, well, if she an expert on something, we'll be happy to talk.
When she looks that good, buddy, she can be on any show.
Anyway, I've got a list of some people. I think that excuse me, I have a list of some people who are in the Hall of Fame that are controversial, and I have another list of people that are not in the Hall of Fame, which is controversial for the simple fact that they might be in there. And plus, I got some questions to ask Clue. And before I start those questions, maybe Clue wants to let everybody know how long he's been interested in the Hall of Fame and what he's done to become the expert he is.
Well, thanks, Bernie. It's a pleasure to be on. What can I say? I have been reading about the Hall of Fame for nearly 40 years now. In fact, my very first baseball book that I can remember reading about baseball was this little yellow book in the early 80s from a Scholastic book fair that I got in sixth grade about Hall of Fame players. And reading through the book, and everybody who was basically older than my father, he couldn't tell me about personally. And so reading about somebody like a Pie Traynor or a George Kelly, or certainly somebody more colorful like a King Kelly, a Mike King Kelly, the 19th century guys, that was so much fun. And of course, at that age, I just assumed if they're in the museum, that's because they were, in fact, the greatest players ever. And it was about 10 years later, not quite 10 years later, that Bill James wrote his book, which is, if you want to read about the history of the Hall of Fame, or just how Hall of Fame elections have worked over the years, the single best volume, even 25 years later, is the book by Bill James. It was retitled in paperback as Whatever Happened to the Hall of Fame, and I think that was published in 1994. But the hardcover was published the year before with the very apt title, The Politics of Glory. So I giggled when I saw the title for tonight's broadcast, because politics absolutely does enter into, well, frankly, any election, doesn't it? Not whether it's about sports or something else. And after I read that book, that sort of galvanized me as somebody who was interested in, why are some of these players a mistake? Why are they not as good as the museum makes them seem like, and whatnot? And who is just as good as them that is not in there? And of course, that corresponded with the rise of the internet within a year or two. And so, of course, quite naturally, being into computers, I took to, the one place where you can find thousands of people who are interested in whatever niche topic you're interested in, and that's going online. And so I've been arguing online and learning online, and continuing to expand my knowledge base and corresponding with people. And my SABR membership has certainly allowed for that. To expand my knowledge base as far as the history of the elections, and the stories of the candidates, and the arguments for and against people who are both in or not in. And it's just become, I don't know where else a history buff would be interested. What's more historical than, the Mount Rushmore, so to speak, of the topic you're discussing. So Cooperstown is the Mount Rushmore of baseball, and I'm happy to listen and talk and learn about it all day long, every day of the year.
Over the years, since you've read from the history of the Cooperstown from the beginning to the end, how do you think the criteria for inducting players into the Hall of Fame has changed over the years, or has it not changed?
It has and it hasn't. The idea originally was to honor the greatest players in the sports history. The issue is that, number one, different people have different ideas on what that is, or who those people are, obviously, and that's perfectly fine. We're all going to disagree on, who's this or who's the best that. But the Hall of Fame from the beginning never really spent much time sorting through how to do it from the get-go. And so the criteria changes with each generation of voters in terms of what they tend to look for as a group or a herd, and how they apply the standards of the past to then current players. But there's always been this, we're here to honor the best of the best. In practice, that's 348 people, 273, this is through this past year's elections, 273 people have been honored as players in the major leagues. And that includes the Negro Leaguers who were in the Hall of Fame. So the Hall of Fame is very nearly 300 players strong. So if somebody's standard is, hey, I think the Hall of Fame is something about the 50 best guys of all time, Willie Mays and Ty Cobb are clearly not the standard. They may be the gold standard of ball players, but they're not the average Hall of Famer. And so there's actually a lot of voters even today that don't recognize or account for that fact. And so it shows up in how they vote. So it's not that the criteria has changed very much. The rules have, certainly, but the criteria hasn't. It's just perception changes. And I think that's important to note.
Well, before we start connecting some of these players to baseball simulations, which is how I got interested in the subject, because I'm sure everybody knows, but for those people that aren't familiar with the Field of Dreams Baseball League, the three of us for the last 2 seasons, and now in the 3rd season, Clue and myself continue on to play in Field of Dreams. And Field of Dreams is a draft league that is heavily invested in Hall of Fame players, and a lot of them were unrecognizable to me, that I did not recognize the names of those players were in the Hall of Fame. And that got me interested and got me into reading about it and looking into the players in the Hall of Fame. So with that said, let's go right into the controversies. I'm going to throw out some names to you.
Sure.
Of controversial players in the Hall of Fame currently that are widely recognized to have caused arguments whether they belong in the Hall of Fame or not. And the first name I'm going to throw at you is Harold Baines.
So we've picked on Harold Baines on my channel here. So it's apt to start. It's great to start with Harold. Let's get him out of the way. I think Dwayne Martz has been waiting for Harold Baines.
Yeah, because King Castro will be rolling his eyes about now, I'm sure. So first of all, let me apologize to Harold Baines. None of this is a slight on Harold as a person or even as a ball player. Being just below the best of the best doesn't mean you were garbage, which is a nuance that some people can't grasp. I think our audience certainly doesn't have a problem understanding that. Baines's election, which was undeserved and shocking to pretty much everybody who wasn't in the room when the committee voted him in. Nobody saw that coming. Baines' election was undeserved. That's not Harold's fault. That's the fault of the voters. So please direct your angst and disgruntlement where it belongs, and that's not with Harold himself or his family. He's in. It's a done deal. Enjoy hanging out with the most exclusive club in your sport for the rest of your life. Good for you. I would. What a great club to belong to. That said, I will also, in Harold's defense, make this very clear statement, and that is Harold Baines is far from the worst player in the Baseball Hall of Fame.
Well, it's funny you should say
that. Yeah, I think that honor goes to Steve Tate. Just putting that in there.
I got a few other names, so let's throw a couple more out.
I will, Bernie, real quickly. I will say, Baines is he's the least defensible selection that the writers have ever made, but that's a product of the that's today, and the writers should, the writers didn't do the committee. They should know better today, and so they have less excuse today than they did in the early days of the Hall when they made some mistake elections.
Well, the media and public opinion is going to be one of my questions coming up. So let's reserve our talk about that for a few minutes down the road, because I can't wait to mention this next pirate on the list that Beatles will be very familiar with, Bill Mazeroski.
Great player. Arguably the least deserving second baseman in the Hall of Fame. And let me see, at last count, I have the numbers in front of me.
And as a Bucco fan, I completely agree.
There are 20 second basemen enshrined in the Hall of Fame for that purpose as second baseman. He is not among the 20 greatest second basemen in history. Nowhere close.
Well, And
Well, I
now,
mean, you think about
go
you
ahead.
look at Maz. If I just put in as a Pirate fan, he was as Clue said, he was a great defensive second baseman. He really, really was. But I mean, let's face it, Maz, and bless him, I'm glad he's in the Pirates Hall of Fame. He definitely deserves that. But he's known for he's known for one hit. You know, that home run in 1960,
Yeah.
and I was shocked. And as much as I love the Pittsburgh Pirates, you know, Mazeroski. You know, when you think of the second baseman are in there, and of course the guy that immediately comes to mind is Rogers Hornsby, and you cannot Rogers Hornsby and Mazeroski. No. Anyhow, I just wanted to put that in. You know, I'm nonpartisan about this. I mean, Maz should not be in there. I was shocked when he was elected.
Yeah,
Shocked.
Well,
now, go ahead,
go
Bernie.
ahead. No, I was going to say, if you have more to say about Mazeroski, go ahead.
The argument, he got in by the committee. He was never a strong candidate with the writers decades earlier. The committee put him in, and the argument at the time that prevailed, that was made public, was the feeling was he's the greatest defensive second baseman in history, which itself is arguable, but he's certainly in the conversation. And he had the iconic home run, as Beatles said. They got him in only because the one person it was a 15-man committee, and the one person who was adamantly against him because of the guy couldn't hit, was Ted Williams, and Williams was ill and not able to attend the in-person meeting that year. And so they got him in with Williams gone, and Williams was livid over there. So much so that it's Mazeroski's selection and Williams' protest that caused the Hall of Fame to eliminate the Veterans Committee after some 40 or 50 years. And that's when they took the year or two off and then redid it as a not in-person election in the early 2000s as a result of Maz getting in.
Well, that's very interesting. Let's get a little older with some of these players. Everyone knew Harold Baines, and most everyone knows Bill Mazeroski, but how about Rube Marquard?
Rube Marquard, that's an interesting one. That is a early 1970s selection off the top of my head. I think 71 or 72 was his induction year. Those years were with the Frankie Frisch committee, and you had two things going on at that time. Frankie Frisch was nepotistic about players that he played with. Marquard was not one of them. Marquard had played in the dead ball era just prior to Frisch, but that was the other thing. You were still having an effect from the Glory of Their Times book and interviews by Lawrence Ritter. Many of the players who were featured prominently in that book were selected to the Hall of Fame by the committee over the next, 6 to 10 years, because it popularized their cases for the first time in years. When you have a huge body of people that have been out of baseball for decades, what is it that would attract the committee's attention to look at any one of those players? It's usually somebody sick and dying, or somebody did die. That's typical throughout the history of the committees. In this case, it was the publication of an extremely popular book at the time, probably the best-selling baseball book in history at the time it came out.
Well, that's interesting. You know, we've got a few other names of these players that are in the Hall of Fame. Yeah. One of them has one of my favorite nicknames, High Pockets Kelly. What can you tell us about that member?
One of the Frisch selections. For his time, he's no better than the Mark Grace of the 1920s on winning teams. Again, Frisch was a teammate. Marquard, by the way, features something else. One reason he was good story in the Glory of Their Times, and another reason that helped his Hall of Fame case, like Mazeroski, he was a World Series hero, and moments like that tended to help people's cases in the earlier years of the Hall of Fame than they do now. That was one way that people drew attention to their case. So if somebody could spotlight something like that, that was a big help to get them pushed over the line.
You know, I don't mean to pick on catchers, but a couple of names pop up on my list when I'm looking at this subject. Ray Schoch and Rick Ferrell. How do you feel about that pair?
Schock was charitably the Yadier Molina of his day. He got a big boost, however, for being the most notable of the so-called clean socks. He wasn't the best player that was clean on that team. That was Eddie Collins, who's, of course, in the upper echelon of Hall of Famers. But Schock was the most notably outspoken against his teammates. Any of you who saw the movie 8 Men Out would remember that. He was getting on to Lefty Williams and others and, running his mouth. Anyway, Schock was a very popular player, and that style of play was more important, certainly for a catcher at the time. I think he was a not good selection. And the analytics going back and supporting his defense don't quite support it to the extent that his advocates would like. For me, he's not inside the above the line. He's below the line. Wally Shang is a player from his era, and I know we'll get to guys who are outside that might deserve it. I think Wally Shang would have been a better selection from that era for catcher myself. The other one you mentioned was Rick Farrell, correct?
Correct.
Rick Farrell was a committee selection in 1984, and this is quite possibly the weirdest story ever. In fact, I thought it was just that, an apocryphal story. However, I've corresponded with two people who were members of the committee that elected him over the years, and they both confirmed this, so it is in fact true. The committee decided to put Wes Farrell in, his brother, who won 20 games several times, was one of the best pitchers of the 1930s. And when they turned in the thing, somebody just had a Freudian slip and wrote Rick instead of Wes, and the Hall of Fame made the announcement, and that was that.
I love that story.
Only in America, right? That a mistake like that, and of course they don't correct the mistake by electing Wes the next year either. So, which is even weirder to me. But yeah, so Rick Farrell is the only, if you want to use it in its most literal meaning, he's the only mistake selection in the Hall of Fame.
Well, I love that story. Now, I don't want to leave anybody out of the list of people in that probably shouldn't be in. So I'm going to throw this out to both Clue and Beatles. Who am I not mentioning on the list so far that I don't have?
Before you get there, there's a third sort of category we need to talk about, and maybe toward the end of the show, or before we get into the baseball sim part of this, is it may surprise some people to know that two upper echelon Hall of Famers, very, very, very big Hall of Famers, were not first ballot Hall of Famers, Rogers Hornsby and Joe DiMaggio. So I'm hoping that we can get a few minutes with Big Clue after we get through these interview questions, talk about those two, because I find those two very curious, especially Hornsby. Okay. There's no questioning those, but we can get to that. Here's one that we could talk about, Bernie. Lloyd Wainer, because Big Clue and I have gone round and round about Lloyd Wainer. So have at it, Clue. I'll even go on mute.
Well, I mean, in my opinion, Lloyd Wainer's the worst center fielder in the Baseball Hall of Fame, which right away makes him the first one to look at if you're thinking about somebody who shouldn't be there at that position in any case. His election was in if I'm trying to think off the top of my head.
I think it was 67, Clue.
Yeah, in the late 60s. So what happened in the 60s before was they actually started making some solid committee picks. Guys like Amos Rusi got in this, got in the 60s. Guys who were legitimately well qualified and had been overlooked for many, many years. That was as a result of biographical research done by the Hall of Fame's historian Lee Allen, and those kind of stopped when he passed away later in that decade. Wainer was actually one of the people who was dug up by that and then amplified, of course, by the glory of their times. In my opinion, Wainer got in primarily on the strength of his older, more famous brother. And again, what a great center fielder. He didn't have to, he's a wonderful defender. And since you don't really have good statistics to measure those things, they tend to get exaggerated through description and memory over time. You see the same thing when people talk about, oh, he was a fantastic base runner, or
He did have a better average lifetime than Baines, 320 hitter versus a 301 hitter. Yeah.
Yes, I agree. But again, Baines is not the standard for the Hall of Fame.
Exactly.
So, and his batting average for his era was not particularly impressive, given the league batting average at the time. I mean, it was above league average, but in any case, I'm not going to, again, tomato, one person will advocate for a guy and one person will advocate against him. But in any case, that's how he got elected. And, and if his last name wasn't Wayner, I don't think he would have had the same level of attention brought to his case.
Well, so Bernie,
yes.
Todd had one. Rabbit Moranville. He's been the subject of some controversy for decades about the Hall of Fame. Yeah. Curious, Big Clue, what you think about Moranville? Now, some people have made the case for Moranville that the Hall of Fame, and maybe you could comment on this with Moranville, that defense tends not to be taken, like considered as much as offense. And people have made the case, well, Moranville was an excellent defensive, his defense was excellent. Therefore, he should be in, even though he was crap offensively. So I don't know so maybe you could answer those two at once, Moranville and the bias toward offense or defense.
There is a bias
if that exists.
Offense. There's always been a bias towards offense, just like there's a bias specifically towards home runs, because that's what captures the public imagination, number one, and because defense is much less better or robustly measured in statistics than offense. So offense is easier to measure, describe, compare than defense is. Analytics in the last 20-30 years has started to close that gap somewhere, but of course those are not defensive stats are not well known, besides things like fielding percentage, which is 100 years old or more. I will say, in terms of the Hall of Fame, you're absolutely correct. Defense tends to be undervalued somewhat, despite a couple of singular examples to the contrary, like the Bill Mazeroski thing. However, the one position in the Hall of Fame where defense has counted for more than offense, as often as not, is shortstop. And Rabbit Moranville is an example of that. Now, Moranville, for people who wouldn't be familiar with anything other than him as a name, Moranville was an extremely colorful guy, very popular player, and he played a very long time. He was probably, it's fair to say, the biggest talent on the 1914 Miracle Boston Braves world champion, which was a big legendary team in terms of popular memory. And Moranville, I'm going to say it this way, and this is my argument why he shouldn't be in the Hall of Fame. But the closest modern player I could compare Moranville to is Moranville was an earlier version of Omar Vizquel. Moranville's probably a better fielder. He was a good field, no-hit shortstop with a really long career on good teams. That's the sum of his argument. Now, whether that crosses over the line or not depends on where you set the bar.
Well, we've beaten up on a few of these guys. Let's look at the other side of the coin, guys that are not in, that should be in it. And I think I'm going to start by asking you. I'm going to break the first. There are several people I want to ask you about it, but I'm going to put 3 or 4 guys in one category, 2 guys in another, and then we can talk about some individuals. Let's bunch together the following players: Barry Bonds, Roger Clemens, Gary Sheffield, and Manny Ramirez. Okay. How do you feel about those 4 guys who are definitely statistically belong in the Hall of Fame?
My feeling is if you belong in the Hall of Fame statistically, as you say, then you belong in the Hall of Fame. The history of the character clause is that it was inserted 10 years after they started by the commissioner himself, not by any popular demand, but because the commissioner had pet people he wanted to see go in. And so he thought that that stuff should count just as, whether he was a good citizen should count just as much as whether he was a good ball player. Well, clearly that's not at all what the Hall of Fame was created for. That's not what the voters have ever used it for or anything. Throughout history, that clause was flat out ignored by the voters 99% of the time. The 1% of the time it didn't. It was when you had a borderline statistical case and somebody wanted to make the argument that the candidate in question was a good citizen. So, like at the time, it doesn't seem like this now perhaps, but at the time, Ozzie Smith going in was controversial, and yet an argument many of the writers made for voting for him his first year. He was a first ballot Hall of Famer in 2002. A popular argument was, yeah, but he was also, maybe he never hit, but he was also an ambassador for baseball. Now, that's a term that can mean whatever you want it to mean, just like character, integrity, and sportsmanship can mean whatever you want them to mean. But it was never used as a negative to gatekeep inductions. Not even, and people have said this retroactively that, oh yeah, well, what about Joe Jackson? Joe Jackson received a whopping 2 votes from the writers for the Hall of Fame in the first election, never received another vote for the Hall of Fame after that. That was 10 years before there was a character clause. People simply didn't vote for him. Now, how much of that was because I'm not voting for a guy who did what he did or who did what I think he did? And how much of that is we just have a really crowded ballot when we're starting off, and a guy that had half a career, so to speak, might not be at the top of the list for me, while I haven't inducted Cy Young and Tris Speaker yet. Those all could have been factors, but the character clause didn't have anything to do with Joe Jackson or him not getting votes had nothing to do with the character clause, just to clear that up. So the only time in history that the character clause has really been used en masse, and certainly the only time that it's been popularly used to keep a player out of the Hall of Fame is part of the steroids backlash, which steroids is its whole own thing, that's well outside the Hall of Fame. But that's the battlefield where people are continuing to fight it, because baseball did virtually nothing to punish these people other than, oh, here's a suspension, for the guys who fail a test. People who want to punish one way or another the guys who never failed a test or a guy who failed a test beyond what baseball did, they use the Hall of Fame to do that. So I personally think that's wrong. I think there's no way you can be consistent with it at all. I don't think it's fair. I don't think it's logical, that approach. I have a totally hands-off approach. What a guy did on a ball field is how I measure him by. If he was a great player, he was a great player. And he belongs in the Hall of Fame. If he was not one of the best players of his generation, he doesn't belong in the Hall of Fame. So that's
well, you mentioned Joe Jackson. That leads me to the other person in that category, and that, of course, is Pete Rose.
Okay.
Any thoughts on Pistol Pete?
Maravich, no, he's in the basketball. If you're talking about Charlie Hustle, though,
yes,
and I know you are. Pete Rose, I believe, belongs in the Hall of Fame. It's another case where the people in charge didn't take the high road, and less than 6 months, in fact, 3 months before he was supposed to be on a writer's ballot for the first time, he had just been banned from baseball the year before, or a year and a half before, and they were scared to death because a lot of writers were going to vote for him anyway. That would give baseball a black eye. And the commissioner at the time, Fay Vincent, sat on the committee for the board of directors of the Hall of Fame, and they changed the rules specifically to exclude Rose, and then had the chutzpah to come out and tell people, oh, no, we're just formalizing a rule that we've always had, wink, wink, and this has nothing to do with Pete Rose, if you believe that. Not that, you can argue whether you want to honor somebody like that or not. I get, there's a good reason to say, yeah, now's not the right time to do that. But is he one of the greatest players in the history of the sport? Yes. Is the Hall of Fame less for his absence? Yes. Should they do it? Yes. And I would say the same thing about Joe Jackson. I personally have more mixed feelings on Jackson, but with Jackson dead, I have no compunctions about doing that. I would certainly hope when Rose dies that they put him in, but I don't see any baseball in their ineligible list. They leave these guys on that list after they're dead. Specifically, the only reason to do that is to keep them out of the Hall of Fame. So I think that's a miscarriage of justice, and they should let the voters decide. That's my 2 cents.
Well, now that we've got rid of steroids and gambling, let's talk about a couple of players that aren't associated with either one of them. The first one comes to mind is Curt Schilling.
Curt Schilling, deserving Hall of Famer, every bit as good as Glavine or Mussina. Contemporaries, just a notch behind the Maddox and Johnson and Pedros of his era. He's only not already in because about a quarter of the writers or third of the writers couldn't stand his social media posts. And that got blown way out of proportion. So I don't think we need to get into the details of that. Everybody listening is probably aware of that. I think that's a fault of the voters. And to me, that behavior by the voters is more unethical and repulsive than anything Curt Schilling ever said in a tweet. But that's my opinion. So,
all right. Well, I happen to agree with you because I think Curt Schilling belongs in the Hall of Fame. I don't think his political views should have anything to do whether his baseball playing ability was deserving to be in the Hall of Fame. My own personal opinion.
Yeah, if you went to court, Bernie or Beatles, and you were on trial for murder, and you knew the judge didn't like you because she's a man hater and she just doesn't like men, wouldn't you have your attorney appeal your conviction? When the judge passed the sentence, I sure would, on the basis that the judge should have recused herself. Well, in the same sense, I think that these people that they're willing to superimpose their personal prejudices. Now, by prejudice, I don't mean how they view ball players or evaluate baseball playing skill, right? There's plenty of room for disagreement on peak versus career or how good a guy was or how long he was that good. We can all debate that all the live long day. But people who are going to say only guys who agree with my politics get to be in the Hall of Fame, or only players I like personally, whatever, or don't dislike personally, get to go in the Hall of Fame. That's a big no-no, and I think you're doing more damage to the sport than that player ever did.
I certainly agree with that. How about you, Beatles?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. I mean, because as Clue said at the top of our little tete-a-tete here, that the idea of the Baseball Hall of Fame was to honor the greatest in the game. And I mean, and you look at it, even the numbers that he brought up. So there's roughly close to 20,000 retired players, and we're approaching 300 players in the Hall of Fame. So certainly, I think it's arguable that the majority, I'm not going to put a number on it, the majority of those players are in there. And there's some guys that didn't have, and you talk about character. David Lando makes a nice point here. I'm not sure about Ruth as far as character, but I mean, he was a good guy. But Cobb and Speaker, I mean, let's not forget that at the time that the Black Sox were given the boot in 1920 by Landis, right? Interestingly enough, there were players who were coming out and saying, well, Cobb and Speaker were doing this and doing that. Well, Landis knew that if you were going to throw if Cobb and Speaker were going to get banned from the game, that would have done irreparable harm. Yep. And there's story upon story. In fact, if you guys read the book that I've recommended a billion times, Tales from the Dead Ball Era, right? Ban Johnson knew, Landis knew the Cobb and Speaker were gambling on games, but they didn't get tossed, right? my opinion is this, right? And I mean, and I'll be the first. You guys know my political leanings. I'm a liberal. I am all for Curt Schilling being in the Hall of Fame. He is much far right than me. I don't give a damn about his politics. Same with Steve Carlton, right? It should be about what you've done on the field. And so for guys like Jackson and Rose, you know what? Put them in the Hall of Fame, but say, Joe Jackson was implicated, whatever, in the Black Sox scandal. Pete Rose had allegedly bet on games, but neither of those instances have anything whatsoever to do with what they did as baseball players. And Rose and Jackson, two of the greatest of all time. Curt Schilling, certainly an amazing pitcher. So I agree. I think we, care. Now, would I want a neo-Nazi in there? Some guy that pitches a no-hitter and then goes out and says, let's kill all the, whatever. No, but I think that, we have to get back to what is the Hall of Fame for, and it's what Big Clue said, right? It's about honoring the game's greatest, and certainly these people that are in it. And I'm sure Bernie, you have more on your list. I think it behooves the Hall of Fame to come back and say, I mean, of course they're going to roll out the same old tropes about Jackson and Rose, right? But what about some of the other guys that you're going to mention aren't in? I think they have to say why they're not. But and Clue knows one of the guys I'm thinking about, and he and I agree on him. He's a dead baller, and he is not in the Hall of Fame and should be. How about it, Big Clue? You know who I'm talking about.
Yep. Well, I'm waiting for that segment here to bring him up.
Yeah.
Well, before we get to that guy, and keep him in mind, because I'm going to let you end this portion of our broadcast with that name. I'm going to use two names there aren't any political or medical excuses for keeping them out. And the first name I'm going to bring up is Billy Wagner.
Billy Wagner will he'll be elected by the writers this January. He will sail in over the line.
I hope so. Billy Wagner deserves to be in.
Yeah,
he does.
He is in his 10th and final year on the ballot, and he got 73. Hang on, I've got it here. 73.8%. So, for all intents and purposes, he got 74% of the vote last year. He's going in this year. So, Wagner. I am not a big fan of electing relief pitchers. I think they've already elected too many guys below they've dipped too low to find guys among the relievers. Relief pitcher is not a position, it's a role. And so I personally compare them to starting pitchers, and a guy that pitched 1,000 innings with precious few exceptions simply isn't as good as a guy that pitches 2,500 innings.
Amen.
However, that said, to me, a bigger principle is the lack of consistency. Every Wagner meets or exceeds the standards that they have established. If Lee Smith and Trevor Hoffman are in, and if Fingers and Suter are in, which they all are, Wagner is every bit as good or better than those five players. So, yeah, Wagner can go in. He'd be the fourth, depending on how you count Eckersley, he'd be the fourth or fifth best relief pitcher in the Hall of Fame.
How about Jeff Kent?
Jeff Kent is a deserving Hall of Famer. He is far from the best candidate they could elect at second base, but I understand why he's a popular candidate, and that's because his case is very easy to see when you just go, oh, look, he's the career leader of home runs at his position. He played a middle infield position, so you don't expect much offense from those positions, and throw in the fact that he won an MVP. That's pretty much the sum of his case. He's a lower third Hall of Famer to me if you want to break it up into tiers. Bobby Grich or Lou Whitaker, by my estimation, would be better candidates, but we can get to them at another time.
All right, and he's
certainly over the line, Bernie. So yeah, that's a good one.
Before we get to the final segment of our show, where we're going to discuss connecting this all to baseball simulations, Beatles, who's that dead ball player you want to ask about?
Well, actually, there's that other segment I wanted to add in quickly. So Sherry McGee and Big Clue knew I was going to bring him up. deserving Hall of Famer. But Big Clue, I wonder if you could take a few minutes before we go into this last part, tying it into gaming. So Bernie's had this wonderful list, and thank you, Bernie, for bringing those up. Would you mind taking a few minutes and talking about DiMaggio and Hornsby? These guys, right? We look back and we look at their careers, and the reason why I stress Hornsby is a longer career, but unquestionably great ball players. And I don't think there's anybody who would argue that Rogers Hornsby is not, as you would say, a top tier Hall of Famer. Yet neither Hornsby nor DiMaggio were first ballot Hall of Famers. In fact, I think Hornsby was a third ballot Hall of Famer. What was the story about those two not getting in?
Those
relationship to the press, or what? What was it?
No, those are both functions of the rules and the sentiments at the time. Neither of those players was denied entry because they were disliked or unpopular with the press. So let me start with Hornsby, because chronologically he's the first candidate on the list. So Hornsby did quite well. He was one of the top 10 vote getters in the inaugural Hall of Fame election in 1936 that saw a record 5 guys elected. The problem was he was still an active player through the 1935 season. Now, I say active player as we would define it today, but in practice by then, he was more or less a player coach, if not player manager by that time. And in 36 and then 37, which was his actual final season where he actually had an at-bat in the major leagues, he's having substantially reduced playing time because he's coming in as a pinch hitter or substitution or something, because he's full-time coaching, managing, and no longer a full-time player. But they didn't distinguish between the two. And in the 1930s, before the museum was built, when they were first doing this, there was nobody in charge. The person in charge would have been not Frankie Frisch, I'm sorry, Ford Frick or Kennesaw Mountain Landis. Neither of them were coming out and setting, here's new guidelines for the voters each year, other than after the first year, they kind of started dissuading voters like, hey, we recommend if you vote the guys who've been retired in first and not the active players. So Lefty Grove, Lou Gehrig, they all got lots of votes the first year. They went away on the ballot, maybe not entirely, but they dropped in their level of support. And that's what happened to Hornsby. And then when the Hall of Fame opened its doors in 1939, after that, they voted to the writers decided we're only going to hold an election once every 3 years. So it wasn't until 1942 that Hornsby got elected, and he was the only player elected that year. Imagine that. Hey, they've opened the doors to the Hall of Fame, and then no elections for 3 years, and then we're just putting in one player. I love Bill James' line in his book when he notes that the only inductee that year was Hornsby. He goes, "Damn big of him, wasn't it?" Thanks for doing us a favor, guys.
Right.
So that was the reason for that. It was because of questions about they didn't have a defined eligibility criteria for active. What made a player active or ineligible or eligible for the Hall of Fame at the time? With DiMaggio, he came on. His final season was off the top
1951.
Thank you very much. At the time, he got on the ballot because you only had a 1 year wait at the time. That was the original, that's what they settled on very quickly originally. And that was it for 20 years. You didn't have this 5 year wait. And what they did at the time was there was a sense among the writers that we need to, that there's too much focus on the more recent candidates. And that's because they had a spate of just a couple of years, really, where they start electing Mel Ott and Jimmy Fox and guys who retired in the late 40s and stuff. And so whoa, what about all those guys back in the aughts and the teens from the dead ball era that still aren't in? And so there was a lot of back and forth about, hey, we went too much to the left. Now we got to run to the right. And so they want to swing the pendulum. So they changed the voting rules after DiMaggio came on the ballot and said, okay, we're going from a 1 year eligibility to a 5 year eligibility. Well, rather than simply grandfather in everybody who was already on the ballot and start this new rule in the future, what they did was, oh, we're only going to grandfather players who received 100 votes. Well, it was only DiMaggio, and off the top of my head, I think Ted Lyons might be the other guy. It was only two people, anyway, that stayed on the ballot. So DiMaggio had to work his way back up through the crowd to get in, and he wound up getting in. I think it was 55 on his third try or fourth try, second or third try. Which actually was it. So again, in both cases, neither one was we don't think much of this player. It was simply a function of, the rules not being effective and set in stone, and people not knowing what to expect or how to react to it.
I should add for David Lando that Ted Lyons was White Sox. So he was talking about a White Sox bias all the way through. Ted Lyons, White Sox. There we go.
Well,
go ahead, Bernie. Go ahead.
I was going to say, we've only scratched the surface of these names, and if we left off anybody, I hope you will forgive us if we left off people that are in that don't belong and people that are out that belong.
You mean like Phil Rizzuto? Yes.
But this is only an hour-long show, and we still have to get to the segment where we connect all this talk to baseball simulations. And I'm going to begin by saying that the Field of Dreams.
This is Bernie reining me in, man. Good, Bernie.
That our Field of Dreams draft league does it perfectly because we do cross-era baseball where we have everybody from the 1890s to 2016 playing together in one league, 24 teams. We use Action PC Baseball, which normalizes the playing field with all these players thrown in a big jar and all shaken together. And out comes
kind of gross, Bernie.
Some very interesting statistics, in my opinion, gross or not. I see players that are in the Hall of Fame that have fabulous statistics when they're normalized to a league like ours, bat 100 points below their averages. And I also see other players like Sherry McGee who outperform their statistics based on these normalization characteristics. So I'm going to throw it out to both of you, and you can decide who wants to talk. Are we doing these players a justice or an injustice by throwing them all together and making them compete?
Well, that's a great question. On the one hand, doing this really, really lets the cream rise to the top, right? You really see the guys, and of course, they don't have to be a Hall of Famer. It's just the guys who in a given year had just an outstanding season, even if they don't hit what they hit or, as many home runs or win as many games, they're still among the league leaders in this. So it does give you an appreciation for that. I think in terms, if you really want to get an appreciation for a player, Hall of Famer or not, the best thing to do, and I'm not a season replayer myself, but the best thing to do would be to play a season replay, because you're then seeing him in the context in which he actually played. So you're getting a better feel of how he was among his contemporaries, which is really what the Hall of Fame. One definition of a Hall of Famer would be that he's one of the greatest players ever. But another definition I think is equally valid is that he's one of the greatest players of his generation or of his era. And that's easy to overlook when somebody is lost in the bigger shuffle. For example, somewhat modern player would be a Thurman Munson or a Bill Freehand, both of whom could arguably be the greatest catcher of either the 70s or the 60s, depending on who's making the argument. And yet neither of whom are looked in the same breath as other
Johnny
catchers.
Bench.
Yeah, neither of whom are thought of in the same breath when you're thinking of top 20 catchers of all time or top 15 catchers of all time necessarily. So it's easy to overlook. And that's one way to go looking at stars. And I think it's fun to see guys like that excel in a league like ours. One of the things that has made me really happy in the Fields of Dreams League is hearing people go, well, who's this guy? I've never heard of him. And I'm thinking, well, I know who he is, but that's because I've researched his Hall of Fame case. And it's fun when people go, man, this guy, several people, damn, Sherry McGee is really good, kind of thing. I was like, you bet he is. I'm glad more people, and it makes me happy that more people learn about some of these guys through this. But if you really want to see them, at their best, you do want to see them in the context in which they played. So in that sense, a season replay is better. You're just not going to see as many different people. And certainly you're not going to see guys from multiple eras, because I personally, I don't know anybody who has time to do a season replay for every season in history. You're just not. So
I have to,
Beatles does both.
I have to say, I just want to piggyback on what Big Clue said. When you talk about doing them justice, certainly, you've got to, I think you do need, I think there are some, what Big Clue would talk about, the top tier, top, right? The Hall of Fame guys, right? Like so Cobb, Ruth, Hannes Wagner, right? These guys they're the gold standard, the platinum standard, what have you. But what I like, Clue, is what you said there. And that was my idea for doing the other league, the McGreevy League, was educational. And what came away from the two McGreevies that we did, and just the 2 seasons I was involved in Fields of Dreams, where people were coming up with, wow, I didn't know about George Sisler, or I didn't know about Ed Roush, right? 2 great players. Sisler, one of the greatest of all time. And yet, you get these Hall of Famers, and like Elmer Flick, for instance, Sam Rice, these guys, Sam Thompson, largely forgotten except for baseball groundyards like ourselves. And so I think, in a sense, Bernie, we do them justice in the fact that we can talk about them. We have 24 owners. Well, yeah, you have 24 owners in the Field of Dreams League. And I would wager that for every owner that's in that league, there was at least 2 or 3 players they had, Hall of Famers, had no idea just how good these guys were until they looked at those records. And so in that respect, remembering those players and knowing about them, somebody's going to come away and say, wow, this Elmer Flick guy, not only did he kick, and he did actually kick the shit out of Nap Lajoie in a fight, he was a hell of a player. And, I love it. I love it.
Had his moment in the sun. Yep.
Yes.
Beatles, you're in a unique position to talk about this, because you do both of those things. You're currently doing the 1922 season with Out of the Park Baseball, and you are well known for mixing players together in draft leagues and replaying them, like the McGreevy League. Which one do you Clue suggests that you're better off replaying the season the players come from, to get an indication how they play? How do you feel about that subject?
So I think that, again, I'm going to preface this by again just going back to an earlier comment. I think when you have the top tier Hall of Famers, and I think that we could easily have a discussion. It wouldn't be much of a discussion, because I think most of us here would agree who those are. Again, that entire inaugural class, and that means everybody that was elected at the first ceremony in 1939. So, by that time, Sisler's in, and of course you have Ruth and Mathewson and Cobb, who didn't show up for the picture, by the way, in 1939. I think that there is, so if you're talking about Hall of Famers like Kai Kyler, like Max Carey, I think it's better to see them in the context of a season replay. Cobb's going to play well wherever Cobb is. And in 2 seasons I've been with Field of Dreams, I saw that. Rube Waddell, another Titan, right? He led the league in strikeouts in 2 of our seasons. So I think that for those guys that are a little less well known, I would suggest, doing a season replay with them. But is one better than the other? No, because again, I can only draw on the McGreevy League, because the Field of Dreams League is excellent, but it's a huge span of years. So McGreevy, the original McGreevy, right, was 1880 to 1919. So you had this kind of microcosm of players, right? This little sample size. And so because you were playing in an era of baseball that was very different than it is post 1920, you got a sense. You had the best of both worlds, because you could almost say that, yeah, hey, I'm playing, Elmer Flick, and I'm seeing Elmer Flick as he would have done. Granted, Flick was facing better pitchers because he wouldn't have had to face, let's say, Mathewson, Addy Joss, and Walter Johnson on the same rotation, but they were still doing great. But I don't think there's a preference. But I think to learn about a Hall of Famer, I think you are better off, as Clue said. I think look at him. If you have out of the park baseball, man, you've got every season. Look at him in a replay, even if you don't want to like sit and replay the season. Sim it out. Look at his stats, and I think that's a great suggestion. Or just read books.
You can do all
Legends. Never go wrong with a book.
We certainly enjoy playing Action PC baseball and Field of Dreams, and I love, and I know Beatles loves playing out of the park baseball, and I see that Legends just stopped by to say hello. And
now here's a guy that would be nice, if I may. You know what? Legends would have been really fun to have on this podcast. Maybe we can get him on some time to kind of, if you will, Bernie, sort of, maybe move this into Legends and his amazing project, because what he's doing, not only making MLB The Show do what it wasn't really designed to do, but Legends is bringing in these guys. It's like it's where you're also learning about, and I'm sure if we had Legends on here, there's probably people in his Franchise Stars Baseball League that was like, I really know a lot about this guy, and he's in here and he's doing this. Yeah.
I really enjoy watching his projects. If we had Legends on at the same time, this would be a 3-hour show, not a 1-hour show.
I'd be fine with that, Bernie. You're the one that's always trying to rein me in. Damn it! Well, I'm telling Mom.
You're famous. You're famous for your 3, 4, 5-hour conversation chinwags, but everything tells me that it's hard to keep the general public on these conversations for 3 or 4 hours.
Yeah, well, bugger them all.
So that's why we're about to wrap this up. And Legends, we will have you on because I find your project to be extremely unique.
Fascinating.
Action PC and Out of the Park bring the statistics alive, but I believe Legends brings the players to the screen, and they are real to me when I'm watching those games. Anyway, I want to thank Big Clue for joining us. I also want to thank my co-host, Beatles Eternally. And if you guys have anything to say before we sign off, now's the time to do it.
I'll tell you what, I'm going to put a question out to the chat here as we close it off. So, in all the years I've been playing baseball sims, whether it's been cards and dice or digital, there's always been certain few players, Hall of Famers, that have, no matter what game, and I have to play against them, and they've killed me. And I'm just wondering if that's happened with you guys. So the guy, and he's one of my all-time favorite players, that always kills me is George Sisler. So just very quickly, when I was an undergrad, we'd set up 9 of us or 10 of us, whatever it was, we set up a league using Earl Weaver baseball. And so we literally, if it was like, let's say it was, Big Clue and I playing, and Big Clue was the home team, I would take my Amiga computer over to Big Clue's flat and we would play. And that's how we did our league, right? It was really cool. So I'm the home team. My friend comes down, we're playing, and I've got the lead. Well, he's got George Sisler on his team. Sisler comes up in the bottom of the 9th, and bases loaded. He hits a grand slam. And from that time on, Sisler kills me every time I've got to play against him. You guys ever run across that where some Hall of Famers just kill you? It doesn't matter whether it's a replay, draft league, just curious. Okay, so Tim has one right here. He says, Tony Oliva killed me in a 1971 draft league. He and a buddy did. Because his opponent was 1971 Rod Carew. Both were with Strat. Yeah. So what about you, Big Clue and Bernie? If you guys have had a Hall of Famer, just doesn't matter. He's out to kill you. What do you think?
Or
is it just Tim and I?
If I say the name, MV will trade for him in the Fields of Dreams League. So
God. All right.
Let me just add, if anybody out there listening to this still after an hour, you certainly deserve a little something for your trouble. If anybody has a question about a particular Hall of Fame candidate or Hall of Fame inductee,
for Legends, it's Mike Schmidt.
how they got elected, why they haven't been elected. I'll be hit me up anytime. I'm always happy to tell you anything I know about it. I might have some information that you haven't run across before, so I'm happy to help people out with that. And Beatles, before we sign off, I've got one thing. I think I had the one piece of trivia for you.
Uh-oh.
So, among all players in the history of baseball,
Mm-hmm.
with at least 8,000 plate appearances, so we're
Okay.
cutting out shorter careers, abbreviated careers.
Okay.
There are only 4 guys who are neither a PED suspect, neither a steroid suspect, nor did they play first base. Only 4 guys with 8,000 plate appearances who aren't one of those two things
Okay.
have an OPS plus of 130 or higher.
Oh, God.
Meaning as a hitter, they were 30% better than league average throughout their career. I'm going to name 3 of the 4 and see if you can guess the other.
Well, you're going to make my brain explode. Well, put it out to the chat too there. So go ahead.
Yeah. Reggie Smith.
Okay.
Indian Bob Johnson.
Yay. Uh-huh.
Ken Singleton. And who was the 4th player?
So not a PED and not PED.
So a great hitter, great all-time hitter.
Not a first baseman.
Not a first baseman and not a steroid guy.
Wow. Oh my God. So it was,
and they're not in the Hall of Fame.
Okay. Dave Parker.
Nope.
No, I just had to say Dave Parker because when in doubt, say Dave Parker.
I'll bet. When in doubt.
Who should be in the Hall of Fame? Thank you. So should Bill Madlock. You see what I'm doing here? I'm throwing out names. So I'm going to get one. I have no idea. Anybody know? Tim, you're a walking encyclopedia.
Indian Bob Johnson, Reggie Smith, Ken Singleton, and this guy. Sherry McGee.
Oh, my God. Sherry McGee. Really?
Yep.
Wow. And another guy we didn't mention, Lefty O'Doul, should be in for introducing baseball to Japan, among other things, and a damn fine player. But so Sherry McGee, really? See?
Yep. Long career, great hitter, not in the Hall of Fame, not a steroid suspect, and not a first baseman. So,
and I don't think.
By the way, one guy I haven't mentioned in this show that I hope I live long enough to see in the Hall of Fame is Dwight Evans.
Dwight Evans, great fielder, deserving of election. Please get him in while forget you, Bernie. I hope they get him in while Dwight's alive. So
we're the same age, by the way.
Oh, are you? That's even better.
So, guys, we'll do a quick wrap up here. First, we do want to thank Big Clue for having on here. Next, the next broadcast is going to be on Bernie's channel. Not sure what it's going to be about. The next one on my channel will be 2 months from now. Is going to be something that's going to be a little bit more, maybe esoteric. This has been one that's been brewing around in my head for a while and might draw only 3 people. But I want to talk about baseball narrative as it applies to baseball sim gaming. So you get a couple months to think about that, how we create narrative. So again, that's the academic in me that wants to talk about that. Just a few quick notes. Do support the Fields of Dreams League. It's excellent. They're in their 3rd season. 24 owners, awesome stuff. Root against Canada. It's very important to root against MV. He's in the rebuild stage. Bernie Strom doing 1917 Red Sox replay and out of the park baseball. Excellent stuff. Bernie's also doing 1949. And what's fun is I'm doing 1949 also, but in a different baseball engine. We're going to kind of compare notes. Dwayne Martz, YouTube Sports Network. Just great stuff. Dwayne just finished the 1907 World Series. I've got to make a logo for 1908. He's also doing 1978 Yankees and Braves. There's no accounting for taste. And using Appa Master and Digital Diamond Baseball. Clee Baseball Fan 879. Tune into that channel. Great baseball. Tim's approach is a lot of fun. So definitely check that out. Legend Sports Universe. We can't heap too much praise on him, can we? Neb McGreevy League is on hold, as I've said. Bernie and I will have we're kind of going to be having a little chin wag of something that's going to come before that. And then lastly, Lastly, for you basketball fans, I am told that today was the opening day for the Courts of Dreams Basketball League, again run by Steve Tate and Big Clue. So if you're a hoops fan, check it out. It's a lot of fun. This is a great community. I want to thank everybody for showing up tonight. I know Bernie's like losing his shit here because I've gone 9 minutes over, but I wanted to get this stuff in. Big Clue, you know what, man? You and I have had so many great conversations about baseball, about all kinds of things. And I'll tell you what, having you in this community is amazing. I really, really mean that. And I hope we can have you on again to just talk about whatever the hell you want to talk about, my man. All right.
Yeah, we can do religion and politics after we ruin the channel sometimes. So.
Sounds good. Bernie, I'm going to let you close it off, bud. You're good at this. I'll go on mute.
No, you don't have to. It's on your channel. You've got control, so you can go close it out. I just want to thank everybody for listening.
Absolutely.
And looking forward to next month's show.
All right. Until next time, guys, we will see you round the batting cage. Good night.